Thanks, Stephen, and welcome everyone. Just get this technology sorted. I've been asked to give you an overview of the bus operations in Australia in 20 minutes. Stephen Ryan gave a Victorian update yesterday, and a lot of the issues have been discussed in previous sessions, so I'll try to make sure that I don't duplicate what has been said before. As background, there's a couple of slides. You know that there's 6 states, 2 territories, and we have 3 islands, excluding Tasmania. You may not know that there's actually 560 councils in Australia. And we heard yesterday that Singapore has 7,700 people per square metre. Well, according to Google, we have 3. So that's sort of an interesting contrast, I think. Australia's population is 24 mil, expected to grow to 42 by 2015. And as you heard yesterday, and you can see by that graph, the number of older people as a proportion of the population is increasing. So this will see increased pressures on government services, including public transport. And based on our ABS data, our population growth has been about 1.4% per annum, so fairly modest. This slide gives you that sense of the 3 tiers of government, which I think you know. The federal government has 2 arms. It's the state governments that procure bus services, and the election cycles differ from federal to state, and local governments, often referred to as shires, are involved at everyday services like bus stops and local roads. So these items that are listed on here have already really been identified in key presentations yesterday. The federal government looking for public transport projects from the states certainly provides us with a new opportunity. So from a state association point of view, we provide member services to help operators in their own businesses. The population in Australia is mainly in the major cities, which hence the importance of the recent announcements about the changes at the federal level. There are often long distances between the centres, and we heard from Sal there's about 817,000 kilometres of road, and representing lots of challenges for any land-based transport. And hence we rely on major highways and regional air services to cover the vast distances. So these are the backgrounds I'll flick through fairly quickly. Turning to what this means for bus operations, it's the states that procure the bus services, as I said, and it's generally a transport arm of the state government, but in some cases it could be education, and there are a couple of examples where the council actually are the procurer of the bus services. As you'd expect in a country like Australia, there's a great diversity in the wide range of services. You can see them listed on there. Some people don't think about the courtesy buses and special bus services and really focus on the contracted route and school services. So there's a lot of tourist and long distance and express services operating in Australia. There's also a lot of community-based tasks carrying passengers from remote locations, those that are disadvantaged from health reasons and those that are disadvantaged by location. There's a lot of workforce transport in Australia as well, and buses often replace rail in emergency and routine maintenance. And the coach services in this wide, vast country of ours often operate like a train link or a country link service. So we tend to think of contract services only, but remember that what David Anderson said about Uber and the flexible services that's coming in, we're seeing the increased planning of services, not just looking at the contracted sector, but looking at mobility, as we heard was important yesterday. With our passengers, we are ageing in population, and so there is going to be an increased need for harmonising these rules that apply across the states. We certainly, building up from yesterday, we need to make it easier to transport people and compete and continue to improve the information and how to do this. And this was certainly a theme that came through yesterday. You may not be aware, but in New South Wales, for example, there's a travel training program to actually help people that rely on community transport, which is if they're health or location affected, to train them how to get on regular services. So that's part of that recognition of the shift that we need in thinking about our community. Patronage forecasts generally show good growth in the capital cities. In regional areas, it's pretty modest. This slide gives you an overview of the bus numbers. 95,000 buses in Australia. Most of them are non-government owned, and they are procured from local and overseas manufacturers. You know that the Australian design rules for buses apply nationally, but there are state specifications as well for buses under state contracts. Many of the contracts themselves in the states specify maximum and minimum age. So you have some sectors that have a bus replacement program, and you have others that don't have a bus replacement program. It's just dependent on the vehicle itself meeting the registration standards. We know that the frequency of bus inspections also varies from state to state. And this is an important point that I'd like to make, that most bus operators in Australia are very small businesses, and they're attempting to manage as best they can and grow in their local environment. So 95,000 buses, when you think about the average bus operator is probably 5 to 10 buses, there's a lot of small businesses in Australia. I think it's fair to say that we are an attractive place for buying and developing a bus business. We have a stable political and regulatory and contractual environment, and despite the differences between the states, I think there is that sense of stability. I'm certainly believing that there's optimism on the renewed infrastructure investment and the increased patronage projections we're hearing, which was a theme coming through yesterday. And this also naturally brings into focus the procurement strategies, where the tendering versus negotiations are important. And in some of my comments, I need to just make sure you're aware that there are always exceptions. This slide about margins and risk doesn't apply in all jurisdictions. There are some contracting settings in Australia that aren't really suitable and need to change. So I'd just like to make that point. And the regulatory level, because we've had Sal and Peter talk, I'll skip over a fair bit of this. It's not a straightforward answer about regulation because of the three levels of government, and when you add the local councils with road and bridge restrictions, you can see that there is a need for a different system. Sal certainly covered this yesterday, so on the slide you can see the work that's going on in fatigue management, performance-based standards, mass and dimension, and certainly a common inspection manual is worthwhile in the industry. So state-based accreditation for those that have them are probably the highest impact outside the contract on operators. But there are many services not covered by government contracts, and that may be different to Singapore, for example, but they still have to, in general, comply with minimum standards for accreditation, which usually focus around the driver and the operator. So just be aware, for those that aren't familiar with the Australian scene, that there's a lot of buses and services operated that aren't covered by contract. State regulations do differ. Sorry, the state regulator usually differs from the contract issuer, which I think Singapore are moving to a different model of that. The main purpose of the state-based accreditation systems are the safety management systems that we heard spoken about. There's increased attention on drug and alcohol programs, and as you'd expect, there's a lot of focus on vehicle maintenance and obligations. And we're seeing this self-assessment, external auditing and increased collaboration as being very important. In New South Wales, I can say that there is a very good relationship with RMS, who've actually created a bus safety officer program where they've got a couple of people just looking at helping the industry with education and training, not involved in the enforcement side of their business. So I think that's an initiative that should be spread around to other parts of Australia. The planning which came through yesterday is certainly at various levels of development. That picture comes from the New South Wales Transport Master Plan. So there are Transport Master Plans, and there are usually regional plans and local plans, but they vary considerably. I think New South Wales and Victoria have the most advanced form of service planning guides, but there needs to be even greater work looking at this increased focus on mobility and integration of services. So increasingly we're seeing cross-town networks and greater bus priority. For example, in Sydney there's a metro strategic corridor that complements the transitways, and you heard Peter Duncan mention about the B-line initiatives that were announced yesterday. So the importance of the system design, as discussed yesterday, was certainly very important and does occur at various levels, and generally those plans are dynamic and they've made up with collaboration with the industry. So what this means from BIC's point of view is that there's been a set of publications which have been spoken about. I won't go over them, and part of this debate is to advance the Solutions for Growing Australia debate. And there's certainly that renewed interest at the federal government is important for our livable cities and growing public transport. I think a key which has come through also from all our speakers is this effective industry engagement and consultation and how we do that. You heard from Michael Apps yesterday about our moving people strategy. So in Australia, I think we are in a good place to manage how we get on the front foot going forward. There's been a lot about innovation, so I'm not going to say much about it. There's innovation on the vehicle types, some innovation on contract types, so we're seeing a little bit of movement there, ticketing, pricing innovation, customer information, but it does vary from state to state, and you can see I've listed there the names of the cards from the different cities that really do a similar function, and you can see the coloured sentence at the bottom. There's similarities, but there are certainly differences in fares and concessions. Just to reinforce what's been said about apps and customer uptake, this is a Sydney-based result. On the left of the screen, they're new app downloads. So in a relatively short period, there's been nearly 2.5 million apps downloaded in Sydney. So that's a pretty impressive number, I think. And the data requests that come out of those are approaching 80 million. So that reinforces what we've heard recently about the importance of passenger information. And the expansion of the travel apps was certainly a key theme that we heard yesterday and this morning. Where are we on fares? Most states set fares for the route and school services. The cost recovery does vary from state to state, and in some cases fares are set by an independent body, like in New South Wales it's IPART. And travel concessions certainly vary, and the level of revenue protection also varies. Patronage incentives do exist in some locations, and recently you may have seen this report. According to a survey, Australian cities were ranked as being very affordable compared to other locations like London and New York as far as fares were concerned. Well, if you ask our passengers, they'd probably disagree with you on that. So here's the topical issues that are around our industry in Australia at the moment. The federal government support for public transport, tendering versus negotiation, can benchmarking achieve and prove value for money, just the extent of regulation and the cross-jurisdictional matters that we've heard about, bus priority versus light rail. The industrial settings are an interesting stage, and I think there's a session that may cover that shortly. Transport infrastructure and making sure that any roads infrastructure has a public transport outcome, and bus procurement options. The way buses are procured in the contract setting is quite, I suppose you'd say, controversial at the present time. So the Bus Industry Confederation has developed a document to try and pull together a framework for contracting. It follows that STO framework, which I think you will know is been expressed at other events, and as you can see, the key elements of a sensible, sustainable contract are covered, and BIC is in the process of updating that document, and hopefully it will be used throughout Australia to give a fairer and better picture of effective contracts. So the contract settings, they vary from state to state, and they're at various forms of generations. So competition policy is certainly influencing decisions about procurement, but however, what the best procurement model is really depends on a number of factors. State governments, this is a relatively new observation of mine, state governments are increasingly under pressure from audit and finance departments to better administer the contracts, and that means different things depending on which jurisdiction you're at. Just a comment on New South Wales. In New South Wales recently, offers of 688 contracts were made in regional rural New South Wales, and although a lot of the contract clauses were similar, the governance, reporting and KPIs varied depending on the size of the operation. So that's an initiative that we've seen how contract types can influence the government's position on settings. So the bus procurement model is different from state to state, and a lot of these factors come into play, as you can imagine. For example, in Sydney, we've got the metro contracts that have been tendered. We've got the outer metro contracts which have been negotiated but using tendered benchmarks, and we have regional rural contracts which have been through an offer and acceptance process which are using an independent benchmarking to guarantee value for money. And you know the bottom line, you've heard operators say this before, if you're an incumbent, you favour negotiation. If you're wanting to become a contract holder, you want a chance to obtain a contract. So that dynamic, of course, applies in most locations. The question about tendering versus negotiation is certainly influenced by access and utilisation of the assets, which again varies from state to state. I think we can say that the value for money, continuity of service, and the government philosophy regarding private enterprise versus government enterprise are the key factors in the procurement strategies that we face. This value for money has really agonised a lot of the industry. What does it mean? How do we prove it? I don't think we can say that one procurement model is better than any other because of the differing environments and the changing pressures. I think you can say that private enterprise under performance-based contracts continues to be the supported and the best way of achieving that value for money, but that of course creates a lot of discussion. And the way of achieving the benefit is through partnership, certainly to achieve common goals. And we're seeing sometimes in the tender environment that partnership to establish the documents is not very good, but in other jurisdictions it's proving to be a sensible position. The key performance indicators which drive the performance generally relate to the things on the screen there. I think they came up yesterday, particularly the focused on customer satisfaction and the ability to capture data electronically and manually is also important. I'm conscious to stay on time, so this is a sample of a dashboard of a KPI result. It shows a customer satisfaction model, and each of those headings I think came out yesterday: timeliness, safety, convenience, etc. And the arrows that go up or down show the changes. So this is a very strong government tool that's being used to show improvements to services, and these are now published, and they're actually a result of independent onboard surveys. So that's a new development in Sydney, at least in recent years. So a few finishing slides. You know that the fact that our Prime Minister actually catches buses is encouraging, and the messages that we're hearing yesterday are very important for looking at how we do grow public transport in the future. Peter Duncan mentioned a couple of new initiatives that have been announced recently in Sydney, and I think they've been generally welcomed by the industry. Although, as you could imagine, the State Transit Drivers Union were not impressed with the proposal to privatise Newcastle buses. So, 40 seconds to go. A couple of concluding slides. Look, the bus contract framework settings are state-based, and they vary depending on the state's needs. There is movement for national heavy vehicle regulation, with the states still controlling the road assets, as we've heard yesterday and this morning, and there's certainly support for harmonising certain standards, but there are lots of budget and timing issues. Bus contracts, accreditation standards, and I'd add enterprise agreement, local employment issues are really driving a lot of the state associations at present. So my conclusion in this fairly rapid catalogue of Australian operations is, in most states, it's the financial pressures driving the reforms. So there's a focus on revenue and costs. So while the economic environmental factors are important, we're in a cycle where the financial pressures seem to be dominating. And I think this is wrong. I think we need to rebalance them. There is support for the tender model in the urban areas where there's a perceived market, but where there's efficient costs and quality and value can be proven by negotiation, that option's being used as well, like that example I gave you in New South Wales. Probably one of the difficulties for improving the contract environment in Australia is that our contract cycles are 7 and 10 years, so that it's often 18 or 20-year cycles. So if you get it wrong, it takes a fair bit of time for it to be readjusted, where our political cycles are 3 or 4 years. So the franchising model has existed in various forms in major cities since 1990, as you probably know, and it continues to change. So I don't think there is one best generic model, but it takes a long time to fix it if you get it wrong. And as David Anderson said, my summary would be, we've got 8 different ways of doing things, but the differences are decreasing. So that's an overview of Australian bus operations. Thanks very much.